Hey, it's Chris. Two big box games, campaign scenario driven. You may have heard of them, you may not have. Campaign fatigue or just completely under the radar hits. A little bit of both. You want to know? Tamashii, Chronicles of Ascend from Awaken Realms. Tales from the Red Dragon Inn. Let's go. Now we're going to start with the Tamashinator here. Got to slide this over to the side, but I also want you to be able to see it from the top down view here for a second so you can just take a look and see how much component we're dealing with in the base game, right? Tokens, locked cards, unlocked cards, dump areas, standees to go along with it if you're team standee, but don't worry if you're not team standee. We got a whole line of miniatures here to go along with them as well, a la the usual Awaken Realms. But what you're doing in Tamashii, that's really what we're talking about here. And the core crux of this game is something that I think is underrepresented, underutilized, and actually done really, really well in this game. And I think it suffers from the Kickstarter crowdfunding hobby hype scene in general of campaign level fatigue. And so I think it's gotten overlooked. Similarly, we'll talk about in a second with Tales from the Red Dragon Inn. But the main thing I'm talking about here is this little baggie right in front of me, right? No, not those baggies that you're used to seeing in this hobby, but a cloth baggie. Because this is, at its core, cyberpunk theme there, we'll get there in a second. This is a bag builder. This is a bag builder pattern matcher. And if you ever played Bullet is one of my all-time favorite games from Level 99 Games. Essentially, you have your little patterns that you grab from the bag, your tokens, and you lay them out onto your launcher here into the highlighted areas, all representing your various icons, powers, whatever they may be, right? And so you get to have a few out there, and maybe you fill up all of your spots, depending on how many you draw from the bag, and then you're slowly going to be pattern matching, manipulating when all of the spots that you can fill up in the round eventually become full. And then you're going to be looking at your card, your character, your asymmetric body, hence the cyberpunk theme here, to, well, create combos, to create chains, to attack the AI drone system that is going up and trying to stop you in this scenario-driven situation as you explore your little hex-based map in the individual scenario that you're dealing with. And to be completely transparent here, this mechanic of the slight manipulation of how you're moving these, trying to get them off the highlighted spots in order to fill them and then create your patterns in that way, it really just frickin' works. This is probably one of the most solid Awaken Realms mechanics in any of their games. Period. I mean, those are some strong fighting words, right? Right. The core of this game, with the abilities, with the asymmetry, with the unlocks, with the ability to adapt to what's in front of you with these tile-based situations, either slowly dealing with trace, which is what the game calls your potential risk of exposure to the AI system, as you slowly go through these with asymmetric actions on the individual tokens here. It just works, right? Refilling your launcher, data dumping when you create, the pattern that allows you to get more power or gives you more shields or recharges your health or allows you to augment and upgrade your characters on the sides of the board that you need in order to achieve the scenario-driven system's objective. I'll make the argument that Awaken Realms has outdone themselves there with the core mechanic here. This is one of the most fun core mechanics because you're also doing this manipulation on the launcher side of things, right? You're doing it simultaneously along with everyone else at the beginning of each round. And so the game utilizes these bodies because death is not final, right? You actually die and get reset into a new body depending on, well, what happens and what's available, or just whichever one you get selected to at the beginning of the round. And so you can see that the pattern matching is different for the abilities here, as opposed to any of these other bodies. And a la similar other scenario campaign driven situations, you'll have these bodies that you're able to start with and be able to choose from, but then you'll also have a whole section, a slew of these, right, potentially, not to mention all of the ones that I, sort of alluded to a minute ago here in the box that you're going to be unlocking there, and a significant amount of cards that you're going to be having at your disposal along those lines. And that ability to mix and match is just fantastic. Scenarios are driven by connections between the conditions that you're setting up with, the enhancements that are going to be available, the goals that you're going to be trying to achieve, as well as player versus player if you choose to do that. And we'll talk about that later, how I feel about that. But variable map setups, just a ton of options to give you plethoras of gameplay, whether you're playing scenarios or even wanting to do your little one-off for PvP. Enemies, similarly here, are again going to be varied, and you can see the strength is a 1 on most of these. Until you start getting a little lower, you start to see 2s or even higher 3s. And these enemies are going to give variable attacks, defenses, abilities, depending on what you're doing roll-wise as well, because rolling in this game, mitigation is necessary, and that may be the biggest make it or break it when you're looking through some of these and seeing, okay, which enemy lined up to me because I had too much trace and they're disrupting and, essentially attacking you as opposed to your cohorts, if you will. And that's probably the biggest downside of this game. With this manipulation that we were just talking about, right, there are very few abilities or schemes that allow you to help your compatriots in that way. So as a cooperative driven game, it really kind of potentially misses the mark there, because it is a little multiplayer solitaire in the same sense. Not that that's bad, because it allows you to focus on what you're doing, but when I play something cooperatively, I like to be able to have some interaction and some assistance, right? When I played video games online, I was a healer. I liked to mitigate. I liked to dole out ways to help. I am a Spirit Island utility or fear player where I can help in other ways. And so this game does lack a little bit of that with the plethora of abilities, augments, and bodies that it gives you. It just sort of doesn't have quite as much of that immersiveness that I prefer. But the bodies themselves, you're going to have different classes that are going to go along with them to augment, to asymmetric, if you will, to use it in that sense, different abilities that can be unlocked and that can be utilized as evidenced by the color here. So you can start to see all of the different ways and the different powers that you can see that are going to be available at your disposal. I mean, they have done a tremendous job with this. This is by far and away one of the coolest mechanics that is, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, highly underutilized. And you're allowed to tailor not only the abilities, but that's where the bag building comes in, is you're going to be able to mitigate or delineate, choose which ones you want in there and which maybe ones you want to get out, to sort of strategize which abilities I'm going to be strengthening on. So you may not be able to directly affect your compatriots, like I mentioned, but you may be able to specialize in the same manner in order to aid them in your own unique way. The biggest problem I have with this game otherwise is because it is your scenario-driven campaign-ish style situation, right? You end up with a lot of stuff locked behind walls, a lot of stuff locked behind, I went this way, you went that way, I chose this, I decided to do this sort of situation, which means you don't ultimately maybe get to explore all of those niche avenues that you'd like to. And ultimately, sometimes the cool stuff is just not available to you from the get-go. So patience is rewarded in this game with the unlocked section of this, if I can pull it out here, the locked component section here, and you can see that there is just a ton of cartage that's going to go in all of those and more areas that I just described and showed you, even more so, if you can imagine that. But therein lies the blessing curse of this, right? Do you have the bandwidth? Do you have, as I mentioned, the fatigue to be able to get through enough of these scenarios to really explore the depth of a game like this that it deserves in the first place? Like I mentioned, your enemies actually attach to your individual hero. So I actually prefer that mechanic, relativistically speaking, when we're playing other games like Marvel Champions or things like that, where you are going one-on-one in those areas and those aspects. But that may not be something that you enjoy. Also, like I mentioned, you have dice that you're going to be dealing with that you're going to be rolling, you're going to be utilizing to mitigate, you're going to be having to roll alongside when these enemies attack, and attacking, knocking out based on what damage you do or how the enemy potentially is going to go after you with those cards that match those symbols that I just rolled. That may not behoove you because you're also, potentially better off hacking rather than attacking. And so if you're looking for more of a slugfest type of game, this one, again, may swing and miss in that sense. But if you're looking for something a little bit more tactically sneaky up here, I'm going to outmaneuver you at the same time, not just outbash you, it does a pretty good job at that too. The hex-based situation is still good. It's relatively a lot easier to set up than a lot of other games. I'm even looking at you behind me, Cthulhu Death May Die, where that's sometimes a pain in the butt to find all of the coordinated ones. I mean, it's relatively smooth and simple. You've got your hexes, you've got your numbers on them, and you can just sort of, do it however you need to do, and it's not difficult. The hardest thing, again, is the unlocking and the waiting for the unlocking. The other difficulty that I have is just that, the rulebook is not going to necessarily be your best friend. I read through it twice and then I still had to go watch a video, and that seems to be, on par for a lot of the Awaken Realms games, where it's like, okay, I feel like this game tends to be more of a game that internally we've played rather than purely you can learn everything you need to exactly in the way you need to from the rules alone in the first place. And again, that's one of those, I'm shouting at clouds from my hill and my grass in my yard, and that's not a big deal to a lot of other people, but I think it's still worth mentioning, just because, everybody learns things in different ways, and you should, hill I'm gonna die on, be able to learn a game solely from a rule book. Otherwise, why even make the rule book in the first place, right? I mean, another pro is this is probably by far the most cyberpunk game that you could possibly want. And so they incorporate it thematically in all of the areas. And the artwork is fantastic. It really does incorporate it. And again, like I mentioned, right, Team Standee here, these are fantastic. I give kudos where kudos is due. Team Standee pledging loyalty if you're putting out good quality stuff from that side of things and supporting it. I'd say the other con is, the storage solution, as you can kind of see overhead here, is not the best. Just not a huge fan of the numbering system on some of these cards either. This XXXX situation you've got on some of these cards, and just how they exactly get broken down and lined up, it's just a little bit convoluted for what it needs to be in the same regard. So again, I don't think there's a problem, but it just is sort of the Awaken Realms making complicated for the sake of making complicated, which I fear is a little bit of the expansion content to go along with it too. But I would make the argument that, like a lot of Awaken Realms games, if you had just the base game like this, you'd have more than enough. I don't think the expansion stuff, the stretch goal characters, are anything necessary or anything to write home about. They're nice plethora for the sake of plethora to give you options, but none of it is make it or break it, which again, blessing or curse depending on how you feel about that with some of that content in the first place. So overall, really this game should be getting more attention, but I think campaign fatigue, I think just the overhead of a game like this, because that's probably the underlying thing I will say more than anything else, is it's a little bit more complicated to learn, not to actually play, but to learn than it could be. But like I said, the rulebook is still not the easiest read in terms of understanding, and it's still, a good, almost 25 pages of playing in order to actually comprehend. So for Awaken Realm side of things, that's really good. But for an accessibility with keywords, phrases, and icons all over the place still, that's still not insignificant. So I think it's a better tempering of the expanse that Awaken Realms has put out in the past comparatively. But I think, again, it's still, with some of the difficulty issues and concerns, which, again, sometimes it's too easy, sometimes it doesn't ramp up strongly enough. The player count dynamic, I can only speak having played it at 2 players, but one of the main criticisms I saw online of other commenters and other paper that I can't really comment one way or the other is that they didn't feel like the scaling difficulty was as good at higher player counts. So take that for what you will, more than anything else, rather than a judgment. All in all, is it worth a look-see if you're looking for something pretty different comparatively from a scenario-driven standpoint? Yes. Are you going to get your money's worth on these scenarios? yes, I think there's enough variability, and that's probably the commonality with Tales from the Red Dragon Inn, is the variety of the actual scenarios, the variety of all of those things that I mentioned, the bodies, the setups for the actual scenarios in the first place, and giving you so many options to go across the board, as well as just the variety in how you can augment, swap, or even fight. Not to mention, well, the real, crux of this game is this, which is absolutely the best part of it, without any question. I'd love to see the corners smoothed out in some of those issues. I'd love more focus on this as opposed to some of the side tracks of maneuvering all of that and the extra mechanics. Like just distilling it down to majority this with a little bit of grid, rather than having like a bunch of icons and dynamics over here and a bunch of assets over here. I just wish sometimes less is more. And this is better, I feel like, than a lot of their other offerings, but I'd still like to see more in that sense, if that makes sense. Right sense? Okay, Tales from the Red Dragon Inn. So now up, then obviously we have Tales from the Red Dragon Inn. Now, truth be told, I'm not a huge fan of this artwork and their style, right? That being said, the gameplay with this one will definitely win you over. However, you need to be looking for a lighter style with less complexity, but builds on it as you would something like Jaws of the Lion, only making a little bit more sense, as well as just more intuitiveness, especially if you're not familiar with this. The elephant in the room, the giant elephant in the room, though, with this one, just like Tamashii, as we're talking about, right, is stuff, right? In a good, but perhaps overwhelming manner, right? I literally, right, these bags are full, just chock full of tokens, right? Absolutely is difficult to handle. At the same time, you're utilizing so potentially few of them on an individual map by map basis with the enemies, the AI system, the initiative that is more reminiscent almost of an Aeon's End, but the simplicity of, just a roll and move, if you will. Take that for what you will for a second, though, because what you do on your turn is, right, you move and attack and maybe some shenanigans. That's the gist of the game, because then you just get to rinse and repeat. And the great thing, and why the Jaws of the Lion comparison is so apt, is that it builds upon it, right? This is map 1, right? It's a foldable map. Foldable map. You flip it over, all of a sudden you got map number 2. And you've got a few different enemies. You've got a few enemies that are similar. But there are so many enemies. So many scenarios. This bad boy right here. This is the map selection, right? And say what you will, it's really freaking nice not to have to assemble out of cardboard. And look how much space this takes up. Whoo dog, right? Them's fighting words. But at the same time, right? This is what you're getting. This is what you're getting. And so does that matter to you? It's not going to have the table presence maybe that you want. But when we're evaluating games, you know what's a criteria on how much a game I think is good or how much I like it? It's not table presence, folks. Table presence is at the bottom of that list. Gameplay. And the gameplay just frickin' works. The variability, the map setup, the hex-based situations, the AI system, nothing's going to make you jump out of your skin in terms of learning. And it adds and adds and adds and adds and adds. So you're not learning a 50-page rule book from the get-go. It's adding the things that make the dynamics more important. And as I always say, what matters more is not the thickness of the rule book, because that's going to make it harder to get played. But if you can add those dynamics one by one by one, right? It's really hard to add up 14 plus 14 plus 17 plus 18 right now in your head, right? And that's 73 for those of you doing math along with me very quickly. But what's really easy is if I said 10 plus 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 3, right? That you can do that. You can do that math. And that's what this game incorporates in the mechanical approach. And it's doing something that is not completely uniquely different, You've seen these types of things, the enemies over here, ad nauseum, right? You've got your health, you've got your AI system, you've got all of your dice you're going to be rolling there to go along with it. You've got your mini bosses, you've got your minions here, right? You've got the boss all of a sudden with 30 health down here, the gelatinous blob, and how it does sort of those dynamics of pushing and pulling and moving and ranging all just straightforward. Because you can have all of those mechanics, but they don't all need to be so dramatically, uniquely different to make your game a slog to learn in the first place. The big downside, again, whew, that was loud, in this game as a whole, is how much do you like your narrative, right? Because this is what you're walking into in a walkthrough section. These are all of the books corresponding to all of those maps I just showed you. And again, the read first walkthrough does a fantastic job. It's a little wordy though. And so it's just making sure that when you go on to the reference manual, when you go on to chapter 1 here, you don't have a question of what's actually happening. Oh, look, this is what's different this time. This is what you need to know. This is the new stuff. Can you swap your heroes in and out? Absolutely. Can you do one-offs? Can you link them together? Can you slowly unlock more card pools from the aforementioned vault? Yeah, this is actually too tight. I actually ripped it opening it. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, but it happens sometimes. But, you know, again, so much. One is too much and 10 of them isn't enough, right? That's where you may fall in this category. And so that's why this one is worth your money from that sheer aspect of things, without a doubt. Well, it also takes a little bit of that. Well, I'm concerned because, you know, a lot of these, I need to have a certain player count and I need to play with a certain amount of players. Well, you can play with more than one if you want. You can do the two-handed thing like I do all the time, or you can just play with 4 people, or you can play with 2 people, you know, 2 characters. And so you don't need to have that 3 or that 4, which is a barrier to entry for me, personally speaking, in a lot of these games. And so it's nice to have a few of these without that as well. The downside is, again, well, this game is the sum of its parts, right? None of these parts, again, are going to be unique. None of them are going to be dramatically different, right? You're going to be pulling action tokens from a bag to determine the order, a la the Aeon's End that I mentioned. And some bosses may have more, you know, just like the Aeon's End deck, where you've got that sort of being the condition of which, you know, makes it or breaks it sometimes when the game is really that tough. The dynamics, the upgrading equipment, well, you know what? You can just take it out, pick your items and go. You equip at the beginning of every game or session, so there's not as much I need to carry over. I need to have a save file. I need to be able to put these all away in the nice box like we were talking about with Tamashii. Dice are utilized though, so it gets away from the jaws of the lion where you're having to actually use the dice as a, okay, how do I feel about that? You can crit them, you can mega crit them, you can dice pool them, you can allocate them as a resource between cooperatively. Again, kind of doing nice things from a lot of these games, taking some of the better parts and, well, smushing them together. And again, some of the best games from the past couple of years are not these completely uniquely innovative games that people always think are going to blow things out of the water. They're retreads in different ways than you've seen before, using similar ideas and mechanical approaches. Your Ark Novas, your Earths, your Dwellings of Elderville, right? All of those along these lines. And that's why this one, you know, if you're a fan, is definitely needing to be on your radar at least. But again, for the price point, for the amount of content, for just the price to enter, it can't be ignored. At the same time, with the sheer plethora that they have spent making the cost reflective of the content that is available with this, you're not going to have any issue from a value sense either, if you can actually play through this many scenarios, right? It's almost an embarrassment of riches to your detriment. But the narrative side of things is probably going to be a lot of people's limits because, again, just the text amount that's there, do you really want to read that? Or if you're like me, sometimes you skim it, or you're playing with other people, you read it and you just kind of give them the Cliff Notes version. And so you get past that and the gameplay is allowed to shine on its own. So, you know what? Also, don't worry about it if it's not for you. But is that going to change your assessment of the overarching product? Well, I leave that for you to figure out. Again, the other main drastic element that you need to know is this is not like every other crawl. All of these scenarios are offering you something different. It's not just a big slog on the map, go from one place to the other, slaughter everything on the map, rinse and repeat 30 times. If that was, I'd be real sick of this game real quick, and I wouldn't give it that endorsement in that sense. But it's a lot of this is what you're doing, this is what you're trying to do, this is the stuff that's in your way, this is how this stuff that's in your way is going to be different, this is how the players on the field are going to have to interact with the stuff that's on the field in the first place in terms of what's going to be there, how these guys are going to affect that, and how they're going to interact as well. And so that can't be understated about how, again, uniquely and, well, carefully crafted it is as the sum of the parts. And that's why it's freaking good. So I like it. I like it a lot. But again, almost too much of a good thing in both these games. And at what point is that point for you? So that's where my thoughts are on both of these. And that's why, again, deserve a mention. Give it a look-see. Find out whether it's right for you. There you go. Stay classy. Have a great freaking day. See you around.